If you expand the nodes for each database in the Object Explorer, you can see a variety of database objects that SQL Server supports. And for this, I'll use the sample Northwind database. But all of the sections here are going to be pretty much the same for any database that you attach or create within an instance of SQL Server. There's a few of these objects that you'll probably use quite frequently. The first is database diagrams. As you can see, don't have any diagrams installed yet, but if I look to expand it, but because this is the first time that I'm expanding that node for this newly created Northwind database, I get this dialog box saying, this database does not have one or more of the support objects required to use database diagramming. Do you wish to create them? And if I want to use diagrams, yes, I want to create them. And now it has all of the objects and support that it needs in order to create a database diagram. A diagram provides a graphical view of a set of tables and how they're related to each other with foreign key constraints. The nice thing about database diagrams is that you can use them to get an overview of the structure of the database. But also, if you make changes to the diagram, that will make actual changes to the structure of the underlying tables. So it's not just something to explore a database with, it's actually something, a tool that you can use in order to change the structure of a database. The next node that you'll use quite often is the tables node. All data within a SQL Server database is stored in rows and tables, each of which is going to have a defined set of columns, indexes, and constraints. And so I can expand this. You can see that within the customers table, I have various columns that hold information about the customer. You can define various keys, set constraints on the data, create triggers, which these are chunks of code that fire on certain kinds of operations that changes the data. You can define indexes and you can view statistics about the use of the database. All right, then the next view is views. As you can see, Northwind comes populated with a number of views. These are saved queries that select data from one or more tables. It's a convenient way to change how you view the data or how you access the data for one or more tables. And then there's lots of programmability options here. So if I expand that node, you can see that you can define stored procedures, functions, database triggers, and various other kinds of code units that can apply to the data within this database. Stored procedures in particular are saved queries, essentially, saved sets of Transact SQL code, the programming language of SQL Server, that you can use to select data, kind of like views, but can also make changes to the design or contents of tables. Stored procedures can have parameters and procedural code that's written either using Transact SQL, or you can also write stored procedures using a .NET language like C# or Visual Basic. You can also define functions. SQL Server comes with built-in functions that you can call from your Transact SQL code, and you can also define your own user-defined functions. And then another node that you'll use often probably is the security node. Here's where you can define users and groups of users that are called roles in order to control access to the various database objects. There's a very granular security scheme that you can use within SQL Server to protect your data. And then you can also use the nodes here within the security node in order to create encryption keys to encrypt data that's saved within a table. Now, as you navigate a database and other objects in Object Explorer, you can view various details about the currently selected object in the Object Explorer Details window. So in order to open that, go up here to the View menu and select Object Explorer Details. And as you can see, because I have the functions node of a database selected here, for that particular node, I get the set of subfolders or subnodes there. But if I select the Northwind database, as you can see, I get access to all of the folders here, and I also get additional information about the database down here. So it gives me the number of items that are in the list here, as well as some information. The compatibility level is set to 110, which means version 11, which happens to be SQL Server 2012. It's an internal version number that Microsoft uses. You can see that the collation is the default Latin 1. The owner is this user that I'm logged in as. You can look at the date was created, the size in megabytes of the file on the disk system, and then various other kinds of information associated with this database, including various features that are enabled and not enabled. All right, so that's interesting information there. The main window here isn't all that interesting for a database itself. But if I come down here and select the Tables node, then it gets a little bit more interesting. So it lists all of the tables, the schema associated. Remember that all Northwind tables are in the DBO schema. And it has the policy health state and the create date. Now the default views for each object type, tables, databases, various other objects that I can select within Object Explorer. The default views have some useful information, but most object views have additional columns that you can display. So I can come up here, right-click up here, and you can see that for tables, there's additional information. I like to enable the row count, so I'll display that. In fact, I'll get rid of the policy health state. We're not currently using that. Just free up a little bit of space. And now you can see in one simple view the numbers of rows that are stored within each of the tables within the Northwind database. All right, so this shows the additional columns that are available for tables, but as you use this feature for different objects within Object Explorer, you'll find that some objects have very few additional columns that you can display, others have dozens, many dozens. The bottom line is that you can customize Object Explorer details to provide the information that you find most useful. And again, I find row count an interesting count, particularly as I'm developing a database and populating it with sample data and writing code that is changing the information within the table. All right, and I can select databases. There's the default view, so it shows a fair amount of information by default. And you can right-click, and you can see that the list of options for this node within Object Explorer doesn't even fit on the screen. So I have to come down here and scroll down. So there's a wealth of information that you can display about the databases in the current database instance. Another nice thing about Management Studio is that it helps you find objects within this instance of SQL Server. The problem is that a medium-sized database, even a medium-sized database, can easily have hundreds or thousands of objects. And large databases can have even more. And if there's several databases in an instance of SQL Server, then the number is magnified even more. When you need to find a specific object, such as a specific code module with, say, customer in the name, finding a needle in the proverbial haystack can seem easy in comparison. Now, you can click around Object Explorer, explore all the databases. Gosh, I'm looking for that one particular thing, but I don't remember which database it is because I need that code that's contained within it or whatever. Then it can be really tedious to find objects that way. Because you can already see that even within a simple database like Northwind, there's a lot of different nodes, and each of these nodes have multiple levels of nodes between them. The problem is even more complex if you kind of remember the name has customer in it, but maybe customer isn't the first part of the name. So you can't even look at an alphabetized list of objects to easily find what you're looking for. So that's when Object Search comes in handy. It's actually not part of the Object Explorer Details view, but is contained within the view itself. So what I can do is put in a %, customer, and %. The % is a wildcard character. So what this search is going to do is it's going to find all objects in all databases in this instance of SQL Server. And I know it's going to be all databases because that's the node selected here. If I want to search within another context, say just the Northwind database, I can select that here, and then the search will only search within that database. But I want all databases, so I'll come over here and hit Enter. And it'll take a few moments. And as you can see, when it finishes searching, there's a total of 31 matches on that search. So in all databases, in this instance of SQL Server, there's 31 instances of objects with customer in the name. And as you can see, most of the initial ones are indexes. And then we have a few tables. And you can see the schema that they belong to. But we also even have a user-defined function and a couple of views with the customer object. And so hopefully with that information, I can scroll down through this much smaller list and find exactly the object that I was looking for. All right, so that search was within the entire databases node. If I come in here to Northwind and do the search again, notice that we have only 9 items. Much smaller context, much smaller number of objects that it finds. All right, so keep in mind that this search is going to be within the context of the object that you have selected within Object Explorer. And the nice thing too is that here you have, it gives you the scope of that search, so that if you're looking at these objects and saying, oh gosh, this isn't what it is, oh right, I searched just for the Northwind database. Now I can search the AdventureWorks database or something like that. So you can remember what the scope of this actual search was. So you can see that Management Studio has a lot of features that make it easy to access, find, and work with different database objects. The Activity Monitor in SQL Server gives you a view into the current activity in the SQL Server instance. This can be of enormous help in finding problems before they get out of hand or finding a problem that causes slow server performance. In fact, anytime a SQL Server instance is behaving oddly, you can often get right to the root of the problem, or at least get a good idea of what's going on by viewing Activity Monitor. So let's take a look at this feature of Management Studio. You can view the Activity Monitor by right-clicking the name of the server instance in Object Explorer and selecting Activity Monitor from the pop-up menu. Now, the activity on this server is not going to really be all that interesting. I don't have any processes running against it. I haven't run any queries against it really yet, and so forth. So it isn't going to be showing very much activity. But I can show you the different features of Activity Monitor, and you can imagine what it'll be like if this was a heavily used production. And you can imagine what it would be like if this is a heavily used production system. So the first section is the overview section here. This provides a graphical view into the current server activity. And these graphs present information about the percent of processor time being used, the number of waiting tasks, and the database I/O in megabytes per second. And you can scroll over here, and there's also a batch requests per second. So these are overall metrics into the current level of activity. They're updated every second or so, so if there was any real activity on the server, you'd see these being updated in real time. And then there's some additional sections down here. I just have to click on each section to open it. The Processes section displays information about database connections and the types of tasks that each are performing. The data is listed by server process ID. If I expand this a little bit, you can see the names of the column headers there. This is also sometimes referred to as the SPID, the server process ID. And you can right-click on any of the server process IDs in order to launch SQL Server Profiler to trace the activity on that particular process. So as you can see, there's various processes, most of them going into the master database. That's the main database that SQL Server uses in order to manage the overall instance of the server. And then there's also a tempDB, which is kind of a scratchpad database for storing information temporarily during the execution of code. And there's various other metrics that you can view there. Next is the resource waits. This indicates the amount of time that various threads are waiting for resources, such as memory and processor time. This is a very important panel to view if the server is acting very slow, is performing very slowly, because you may have many conflicting requests that are trying to get access to a resource and they're being blocked. And so here's where you can see information about those kinds of problems. Then there's data file I/O. This shows database and log file input and output information, including statistics on the amount of data read from and written to the disk. This information is the sort of thing that can help you find databases that are being especially hard hit with activity, causing disk activity to be bottlenecked for performance. And as you can see, there's various entries here for various databases. But there isn't much activity going on. And then finally, there's this recent expensive queries section. This is some nice information, particularly when you're writing queries and there seems to be any kind of problems. So it displays information about recent queries that made the greatest demands on various server resources. And you can use this information to identify problem queries that are making unusually high demands on the system, because very often it may be possible to rewrite queries so that they don't make such intense demands. And as you can see, it updates itself periodically. SQL Server is running various code items in the background. But most of the items listed here are the results of my creating the various databases. And so you can see various insert into queries and so forth that populated some of the databases with data, particularly the Northwind database. And a nice thing about all of these tabular views is that they let you search and filter the various columns. So for example, if I come up here to resource weights, I can select on the weight category, that little drop-down box there, and I can filter them on different types of weights. So if I only want to look at locks, I can select just locks, and that simplifies the list. Again, if this is a heavily used server, that could greatly simplify the data that's presented and give me a better view, let me find exactly what I needed. So overall, Activity Monitor is probably the first go-to tool to try and figure out the source of any kinds of problems that are appearing within an instance of SQL Server. You're not limited to working in Management Studio with a single instance of SQL Server. You can connect to other instances, whether they're running on the local machine or another server on the internet or another server across the network. As long as you can connect to the instance, you can use pretty much any feature in Management Studio on that other instance, assuming that you have the necessary security permissions on that other server. Management Studio has several different ways to connect to other SQL Server instances. So let's take a look at a couple of those. One way is to use the Connect button in Object Explorer. So you can connect to a database engine or the various other services that are supported by SQL Server and Management Studio. And if I click on Database Engine, I get that same Connect to Server dialog box, and I can put in the server name and whatever authentication details that I need in order to connect to that other server. It can even be another instance of SQL Server on this same server. Another nice feature of Management Studio is that you can view sets of registered servers. So if you use any servers frequently, you can register them and get quick access to them. So if I drill down into the local server groups, you can see that I automatically have an item for the default instance on the local machine. Again, the local machine is called Win7Dev. And if I want to create another item within the local server groups, I can right-click on it and select a new query, look at Object Explorer for that instance, evaluate policies, import policies. I can even create new server groups, or I can create a new server registration. If I click on that, it'll prompt me for the connection information, and I can even change the name of that registered server so that it appears with a different name within the registered servers window. And I also have access to additional connection properties, just like the Connect to Server dialog box. So this makes it really easy to get access to other instances of SQL Server, particularly if they're instances that you use frequently and don't want to constantly have to re-enter your credentials for connecting to that server.